In the winter of 1902, two sisters were found alive in a homestead in the high ridges above Culver's Gap, Briar County, 5 weeks after both their parents had died, with no sign of illness, no sign of injury, no grave anywhere on the property, and a pantry that should have run empty 3 weeks before anyone came looking. That's strange enough on its own. It isn't why this story is still being pieced together over a century later. The reason is sitting today in a climate-controlled storage room at the Briar County Historical Society, in 2 patient files catalogued 14 years apart, by 2 different archivists, under 2 different collection numbers, filed on opposite ends of the same shelving unit, because nobody who processed either one had any reason to think they belonged together. Inside each file is a set of hand-copied wall tracings, made by a hospital orderly in 1902, of drawings that covered every surface of 2 separate rooms in a since-demolished sanatorium ward. Neither drawing makes any sense on its own. Held up together, edge to edge, they form one image. A single, detailed, unmistakable place. And that place did not exist anywhere in Briar County in 1902. It wouldn't exist for another 32 years. Tell me where you're watching this from. Hit like if a mystery that starts with 2 mismatched files on a shelf is exactly what you come here for. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. And tell me in the comments, have you ever found 2 pieces of something that weren't supposed to fit together, and did? The sisters at the center of this were named Verity and Iris Bell, 19 years old, the 2 young women found alive at that homestead above Culver's Gap. In a Briar County winter, 5 weeks alone should have meant a homestead gone to ruin, animals dead or scattered, both sisters in no condition to be found upright. That is not what the search party found. What they found, according to the account left by the man who led that search, a circuit-riding stock inspector named Halloway Combs, whose report survives in the same historical society collection, was a house cold outside and warm within, 2 sisters seated calmly at the kitchen table, and a pantry stocked with preserves that should have run out 3 weeks earlier. Combs wrote that Verity, the elder sister, looked up at him when he opened the door and said only, "You took your time." He noted, too, that both young women were dressed for the season, hair kept, hands unmarked by the chapping 5 weeks of solitary winter labor should have left. Whatever the sisters had been doing since their parents' disappearance, Combs wrote, it did not look like survival. It looked, in his own word, like waiting. The first strange detail isn't the food, or the timing, or even the sentence. It's what wasn't in the house at all. Combs's report notes that he searched the property from cellar to attic looking for some sign of how Josiah and Ada Bell had died, illness, accident, violence, anything, and found nothing. No grave, no marked ground, no clothing set aside the way a family sets aside a dead parent's things. The sisters, when asked directly where their parents were, gave the same answer both times, in the same words. Though Combs questioned them separately, they went on ahead. Verity and Iris were brought down to Culver's Gap and, within the week, transferred to the Ashgrove Sanatorium, a private mountain hospital that took in a mix of consumption patients and cases the local doctors didn't have the facilities to manage themselves. Sanatorium policy, standard for the period, separated female patients by ward according to their intake condition rather than any family relation, which meant Verity and Iris, despite arriving together and never having spent a night apart in 19 years, were assigned to different wards on opposite ends of the building, and remained there for the whole of their stay. Neither sister objected to the separation, according to the intake nurse's notes, which is itself worth sitting with. Twins who have shared a room their entire lives are not, as a rule, calm about being split apart in a strange building by strange adults. The intake nurse, a woman named Sarah Odell, wrote only that both patients accepted the arrangement without complaint, as though they had expected it. 3 days into their stay, staff on both wards independently reported the same problem. The sisters were drawing on the walls, pencil first, then chalk, then whatever else they could find once the pencils were taken away, and neither one would stop, and neither one seemed to think there was anything unusual about it. What made it a matter for the head physician rather than simple discipline was that both wards reported it the same morning, roughly the same hour, in separate parts of the building, with no way for either sister to have known the other had started. Staff on Iris's ward assumed at first that word had reached her through ordinary hospital gossip. That held for exactly one day, until a nurse confirmed, by asking directly, that neither sister had received any visitor, letter, or message since intake, and that the two wards were separated by enough distance and enough locked doors that a whispered rumor crossing that gap inside 3 days strained belief on its own. The physician overseeing both wards was Dr. Ambrose Teal, a Briar County native trained in Richmond, methodical by every surviving account and not a man given to superstition. When he examined Verity's wall first, he found what his own case notes describe as a fragment, a partial structure, stonework, incomplete at every edge, as though the artist had run out of wall before running out of image. He assumed, reasonably, that the drawing was simply unfinished. He made the same assumption an hour later, on the opposite side of the building, standing in front of an equally incomplete fragment on Iris's wall, different stonework, different angle, equally unfinished at every border. It didn't occur to Dr. Teal to compare the two drawings directly for another 11 days, because it didn't occur to him that there was any reason to. The sisters, after all, were on opposite ends of a large building, seen by different staff, and had had no contact with each other since intake. What finally changed his mind was a comment from an orderly named Wendell Pruitt, who worked both wards on alternating shifts and had, without any particular design, started making his own rough copies of each drawing in a personal sketchbook, not for any medical reason, he said later, simply because the drawings unsettled him enough that he wanted a record of his own, separate from a hospital's. Pruitt was the one who noticed. Carrying his sketchbook between wards on an evening in late February, he happened to lay his two most recent copies side by side on a supply room table while sorting through the pages, and saw, before he understood what he was looking at, that the ragged, unfinished edge of Verity's drawing lined up, stroke for stroke, with a ragged, unfinished edge of Iris's. He brought both pages to Dr. Teal the next morning. Dr. Teal, by his own account, spent the better part of an hour simply holding the two sketchbook pages together at different angles before he was willing to accept what his own eyes were telling him. Put together, the two fragments formed a single continuous image, a low stone structure set into a hillside, long and low rather than tall, with a row of narrow openings along its face and a distinct stepped foundation descending into what appeared to be a cut embankment. It was not a building either sister could plausibly have seen. It matched no structure standing anywhere in Briar County in 1902, and Dr. Teal, who had lived in the county his whole life, told Pruitt directly that he did not recognize it at all. If a mystery like this one has held your attention this far, I think you already understand why it stuck with researchers for over a century rather than fading the way most odd hospital stories do. Dr. Teal did what any careful physician of the period would do with an unexplained detail. He wrote it down, filed it, and moved on to the sisters' actual medical care, which by every account remained entirely unremarkable for the rest of their stay. Verity and Iris Bell were discharged from Ashgrove Sanatorium in June of 1902, 5 months after their admission, into the custody of a maternal aunt in an adjoining county. Dr. Teal's discharge notes describe both sisters as physically sound and mentally unremarkable, with no further comment on the drawings at all, as though, once the sisters left the building, the matter simply stopped being anyone's concern. The wall drawings themselves were never photographed, because photography of that kind wasn't standard hospital procedure in 1902. What survives are Wendell Pruitt's hand-copied sketchbook pages, which he kept for the rest of his life and which his family eventually donated to the Briar County Historical Society in 1961, nearly 60 years after he made them, filed, at the time, simply as hospital sketches, unknown subject, Ashgrove Sanatorium, with no connection made to the Bell sisters' patient files at all, which had been donated separately by a different family in 1975. That's how the two files ended up on opposite ends of the same shelving unit for another 44 years. Nobody at the Historical Society had any reason to connect an orderly's private sketchbook to a set of patient intake records unless they happened to read both collections closely enough, in close enough succession, to notice the overlap. That's exactly what happened in the spring of 2019, when a records archivist named Marianne was assigned to digitize the Society's Ashgrove Sanatorium holdings as part of a state preservation grant, a routine cataloging project, the kind of work she'd done for 11 other defunct institutions without incident. She processed Pruitt's sketchbook first, on a Tuesday, and Dr. Teal's case notes on the following sisters file 2 days later, and it was only while cross-referencing dates across both collections for her finding aid that she noticed the same February dates appearing in an orderly's private sketches and a physician's clinical notes for what were, on paper, two completely unrelated donations. Marianne laid the two collections side by side on her work table, the way Pruitt himself had done 117 years before her, and reconstructed what Dr. Teal had already worked out in 1902, that the fragments matched. What she had that Dr. Teal didn't was the rest of the 20th century's worth of county infrastructure records to check the completed image against. She found the match within a week, in the county engineering department's own construction archive. The structure in the assembled drawing, low, stone, set into a hillside, with a row of narrow openings and a stepped foundation into a cut embankment, was an almost exact match, down to the number and spacing of the openings, for the intake structure of the Culver's Gap Municipal Reservoir. A structure that was surveyed in 1931, designed in 1932, and completed in 1934, 32 years after two 19-year-old sisters, who had never left Briar County and had no access to any engineering drawing that didn't yet exist, drew half of it each on opposite walls of a building neither of them could see the other from. Marianne pulled the original 1931 survey and the 1934 as-built engineering drawings and laid them beside Pruitt's sketchbook pages. The match wasn't approximate. It included a specific structural detail, a slight asymmetry in the spacing of the third and fourth openings along the face, caused, according to the engineer's own 1932 notes, by an unexpected seam of harder rock the crew hadn't accounted for in the original plan and had to build around. That asymmetry appears in the Bell sisters' 1902 drawing in exactly the same place, 30 years before the rock seam that caused it had even been discovered. What made Marianne take the findings seriously enough to write a formal report, rather than filing it away the way Dr. Teal effectively had, was something she found almost by accident 3 weeks later while finishing the rest of the sanatorium collection. Among a box of unrelated donated items, church programs, photographs, a child's primer, was a small sampler, the kind a girl of the period might stitch as a schoolroom exercise, donated in 1988 by a family with no apparent connection to the Bell sisters, the sanatorium, or Wendell Pruitt. The sampler was dated, in cross-stitch, to 1889, 13 years before Verity and Iris Bell were even born. Worked into the border beneath a stitched alphabet and a Bible verse, easy to miss, was a low stone structure set into a hillside, with a row of narrow openings and a stepped foundation. Marianne set it beside the assembled drawing and the 1934 engineering plans. All three matched, including the same asymmetry in the same location along the face. No document in the collection explains how a schoolgirl in 1889, two hospitalized sisters in 1902, and a construction accident in 1932 came to depict the same structural flaw in a building not yet designed. Marianne spent longer tracing the donor family than almost anything else in the collection, because the alternative, three unrelated people across 4 decades stumbling onto the same detail by chance, was harder to accept than what she found. The family had farmed a plot roughly 4 miles from the reservoir site for 3 generations before donating the sampler, close enough to the land that whatever the girl who made it saw, or was told to render into a border pattern by someone older. She saw it from ground that would one day be flooded to build the very structure it depicts. Before she wrote any of that up formally, Marianne did one more thing that had nothing to do with her digitization grant and everything to do with not being able to leave it alone. She drove out to the reservoir herself, on a Saturday, with the assembled drawing and a printed copy of the 1934 as-built plans folded into her coat pocket, and walked the public access path along the intake structure's face, matching each detail against the wall in front of her the way you check a photograph against the room it was taken in. Everything matched, right down to the asymmetry in the openings, until she reached the lowest corner of the structure, close to the waterline, where the original 1934 stonework had been patched at some later date with a section of newer, slightly different colored masonry. A repair, plainly, though nothing in the county's maintenance records specified when or why. Worked into that patched section, low enough that you'd have to crouch to see it, was a small carved mark. 3 short lines meeting at a point, cut into the stone by hand rather than machine-finished like the surrounding repair work. Marianne recognized it immediately, because she'd spent 3 weeks looking at nothing else. It was in Verity Bell's half of the 1902 drawing, a small flourish at the base of the structure that she'd assumed, at the time, was simply where the girl's hand had slipped. It wasn't in the original 1934 plans. It wasn't in the 1932 construction notes. It only existed in a repair made to the reservoir at some undocumented later date, patched in by someone, for some reason, using a mark that a 19-year-old had already drawn on a hospital wall 30 years before anyone had needed to fix that corner at all. Marianne stood there long enough that another visitor on the path asked if she was all right. She wrote, in the email to her colleague she never sent further, that she genuinely didn't know how to answer that question, and hadn't, really, since. Her report to the Historical Societies Board, which she wrote up formally, at her own initiative, though it fell well outside the scope of her digitization grant, does not mention the repaired corner or what she found carved into it. It states only the facts she could fully document: the 2 wards, the matching fragments, the reservoir, the sampler. It ends with a single line that the board minutes record without further comment, that she recommended the 2 collections be permanently cross-referenced in the Society's finding aid, so that no future researcher processing either file in isolation makes the same assumption of coincidence that this office made for 58 years. Here's what I keep coming back to. Wendell Pruitt copied those drawings into a private sketchbook for no reason he could ever fully explain, even to his own family. He simply couldn't stop thinking about them, and needed, in his own words recorded by a grandchild decades later, somewhere to put them that wasn't my head. He carried that sketchbook for the rest of his life without ever learning what the finished image actually was. Dr. Teal held the 2 fragments together in 1902, recognized that they matched, and still discharged both sisters 5 months later without asking either one a single recorded question about what she'd drawn or why. And Verity Bell, the one time anyone thought to ask her anything at all about that winter, answered a question about her missing parents with 4 words that nobody at Ashgrove Sanatorium ever followed up on, because by the time anyone realized the drawings meant something, both sisters were already gone from the building, and neither one, as far as any surviving record shows, was ever asked about any of it again. So I'll leave you with the question that sat with me since Marianne's report crossed my desk. If 2 19-year-old sisters who'd never seen an engineering drawing could put half a building each onto a wall 30 years before it existed, down to a construction accident nobody could have predicted, and if a schoolgirl 13 years before either of them was born stitched the same floor into the same border of the same structure, what do you think they were actually drawing from? And do you think 3 separate people, 30 years apart, only touched it the once? Marianne's report ends with the sampler still uncatalogued beyond its accession number, unassigned to any collection, because she couldn't decide, in her own words to the board, which file it actually belongs to, when the honest answer might be that it belongs to whatever the other 2 belong to as well. That line isn't in the official finding aid. It's in a private email she sent a colleague, forwarded once, and never followed up on. If this one kept you here, tell me what you'd have done in Marianne's place. Filed the cross-reference and left it there, the way the board did, or kept pulling the thread to find out what else might match. Subscribe if you want to keep sitting with stories like this one. And if you've ever come across two things, two records, two objects, two stories in your own family, that turned out to fit together in a way nobody meant them to, I want to hear about it. Those are the ones I go looking for next.